We started a few weeks ago preaching through the life of Moses, and tonight we start the topic of the legacy of Amram and Jochebed, how to raise your children to be leaders of God's people. And I've mentioned some time ago that I am following an outline of the Power Lectureships, which takes place in Alabama every year from 2010. And one of the title that they had for this particular lesson was how to raise your sons to be leaders of God's people. But I believe it's very appropriate and, in fact, essential that we think in terms of our children as leaders for God's people. In fact, the very topic before us tonight, as we talk about Amram and Jochebed, is going to note the importance of strong women leadership. And we have in the church different roles, both males and females, but both are essential. And we need our women to step up and to be leaders of God's people, and while being a different way, every bit as importantly as our men. And so when we think about our children, I think we ought to keep that in mind. For instance, it's important that our children know how to pray. It's important that my daughters know how to pray. My daughters pray at our home, around our dinner table, and they start to lead prayers. I was very pleased with Lads to Leaders when a few years ago when we became involved with them, to see everything that the girls did. In fact, they did everything that the boys did. They had competitions, and with Lads to Leaders, everything's a competition to encourage the children to work hard, but they just simply were in a different room. But yet they learned the skills that are vital, that are important for Christian people to lead our society and to be a shining light for all those around us. The legacy of Amram and Jochebed. So I noted that we're in this overall message, this overall outline that is before us, and we've been talking a lot about families. And tonight we're going to continue that because we're talking about the section of Moses' life, the first 40 years that he is in the palace of Pharaoh. And so the topic lends itself to families. But I don't want you to think that the entire series is on young families or raising children, because we are going to be moving on in a couple weeks to the pastures of Jethro and the passage of Jericho to be finalized at the pinnacle of Nebo. But we looked 2 weeks ago, or several weeks ago, at learned in all the ways of the Egyptians, and then last week we looked at when society wages war on boys, and we noted again similar way that I mentioned tonight. It's not just our boys that are under attack, it's strong Christian principles and Christian leaders that are under attack, both boys and girls. And tonight, the legacy of Amram and Jochebed. Next week, I plan on looking at when a society throws its future away, and that will conclude our first segment of Moses' life. The legacy, though, of Amram and Jochebed. If you would, open your Bibles to Hebrews, the 11th chapter. And we're going to look at verses 23 and following. In fact, for right now, we're going to focus on verse 23, because it's easy to read through this hall of faith, this chapter of faith, and to miss Amram and Jochebed. And the reason for that is right here in verse 23. We see, by faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents, because they saw that the child was beautiful, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. We note here that by faith Moses, and we've read by faith Abel, and by faith Abraham, and by faith Sarah. And so when we get to the 23rd verse, we read by faith Moses, and we assume it's about Moses. But indeed, it's not till the 24th verse that we're actually talking about Moses. Because as we follow through this verse, we see by faith Moses when he was born was hidden for 3 months by his parents. It is the faith of the parents that verse 23 is talking about, not the faith of Moses. In fact, verse 24 then starts to talk about the faith of Moses and what he did. And ladies, as I was alluding to a few moments ago, if we were to turn our Bibles back to Exodus, the 2nd chapter, in verse 2, we would see that what Moses really wrote about when we read his parents hid him for 3 months was that Jochebed was hiding him for 3 months. Now, obviously, Amram was supportive, and Amram played his role, and both are commended for having faith here. But it is Jochebed that is mentioned in particular in Exodus, the 2nd chapter. Jochebed, Moses' mother, had a very special part to play in the delivery of God's people. But who were Amram and Jochebed? I mentioned it's easy to pass over their names. In fact, many people probably don't know their names. Stephanie, you know their names because that was one of our trivia questions that got drilled into us. And many of you other folks had similar situations, and you know Amram and Jochebed. Well, I want to consider, who were they? They were just a couple slaves, weren't they? A couple of slaves whose faith shone so brightly it blinded the king of Egypt. Their faith shined so brightly that forever their names were recorded in God's great book. In fact, we start to read in Exodus, the 1st chapter, and by the time we get to verse 8 of the 1st chapter of Exodus, we read that there arose a king in Egypt who knew not Joseph. David, do you happen to know that king's name? He's thinking really hard, Emily. We'll let him think for a moment. And by the way, Pharaoh was simply an Egyptian name or word that meant king. We don't know his name. You see, the king has long since been forgotten. The slave couple live on by their faith. Much like the chapter says earlier of Abel, or of Enoch in verse 5. By faith, Enoch, when he was taken up so he should not see death, it's not found. Actually, I did mean to say Abel. Verse 4, by faith, Abel offered a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain, through which he commended his righteousness. God commended him by accepting his gifts, and through his faith, though he died, he still speaks. Such is the case of Amram and Jochebed, long since deceased on this earth. Through their faith, they still speak to you and I. What a great, godly couple. As we think back to Exodus, the 1st chapter and verse 8, where there we read of the king of Egypt, that he did not know Joseph. He did not know that Joseph had delivered the Egyptian people, or probably more importantly, he did not care. And so his entire purpose was to oppress or diminish the people of God. And so he set out to destroy them, to destroy their culture by working them hard and humiliating them, and to destroy their strength by killing their boys. But because of Amram and Jochebed being used by God, he never met his goal. You see, it was by faith that Moses was hid for 3 months. It was by faith that a small basket was made of reeds and pitched, likely inside and out. It was by faith that that young lad was laid in that basket and put into the Nile. And it was by the providence of God that Moses was found. It was by faith that Miriam stood nearby and watched. It was by faith that Miriam had the strength and courage to step forward, and it was by faith that caused her to go get her mother. And because of that, Moses was largely reared by his own godly mother. You see, we talked about Moses being learned in all the ways or all the wisdom of the Egyptians. I believe that the downfall of our children is not in what they are learning in school. It is what they are not learning at home. Amram and Jochebed illustrate the importance of godly parents doing what God has asked them to do. We're going to look at 4 points tonight that make Amram and Jochebed's faith so successful and so amazing and probable, or a reason to be followed after. Number one, Amram and Jochebed's faith had a faith that looked into the future. And faith is never affected by circumstance. We are, aren't we? Our circumstance affects us on a daily basis. Something simple in our life can take place and set our whole day off. Set the path of our day or our week or our month or even our year in a direction we didn't mean it to go or didn't want it to go. But faith is not dictated by circumstance. In fact, if you look again at that verse 23, we see by faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents. Why? Because the ESV says, because they saw that the child was beautiful. The King James says, because they saw the child was proper. I tried to dig into the Hebrew and into the Greek here in the book of Hebrews, and I could not decipher which one was more proper or more beautiful. But here, this has always bothered me. How many of you, ladies, I'll ask you first, how many of you have ever given birth to an ugly child? Got my hand up. I don't mean to have it up. What about you fathers? How many of you have seen one of your children as an ugly child? Ella, some of us went downhill after we were born. Me, not you. Not as cute as I once was. But I used to be cute. Believe that? You do. I'm glad you believe that. So, Amram and Jochebed look at Moses, and they say he's a beautiful child. We're going to see, I believe, that what we read in Hebrews is they did this by faith. They looked at Moses. They didn't see the immediate circumstance, but rather they were looking down the road. In fact, we are going to see in the book of Genesis in just a few moments that God had told, I believe Genesis 45 and verse 17, that God told Abraham, your people are going to go to Egypt, and they're going to be there for around 400 years. Don't you think there was a little bit of anticipation building, Emily, by this time? It always seemed so odd to me. Well, why wouldn't they see a beautiful child when they look at their own child? Hebrew writer says, by faith. Faith always comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. You see, Amram and Jochebed weren't merely acting in their own best interest. Amram and Jochebed were acting in God's best interest. In fact, in Romans 11:6, we read that it's impossible, without faith, it's impossible to please God. For any that would come to him must believe that he is, and he's a rewarder of them. That's supposed to be Hebrews. That's why you're sitting up here. I see her head shaking now, and I'm looking down, I'm reading. I said, no, I'm still on Hebrews 11. in 6 says, for without faith it's impossible to please him. They when come to him must believe that he is, and he is a rewarder of those who seek him. You see, Amram and Jochebed took these actions by faith. They're taking them at the guidance of God and for the outcome of what God wanted them to be. I believe that Jochebed likely raised her son to be a leader. Well, how do you know that? Consider verse 24 and following. By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated, or the King James says, choosing rather to suffer with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking for his reward. Brethren, how did he know about any of those things? It sure wasn't the Egyptian king that taught him. It was Jochebed. It was his mother who taught him these things. I believe she did more than just teach him about God. She taught him how to be a leader. In fact, if we were to read into more detail, as we have throughout this series, we know that when Moses makes that choice to suffer or be mistreated with the people of God, that he actually goes out and takes action against a Hebrew or Egyptian soldier. And then he expects the people to follow him. Where do all these ideas come from? I believe it's because Jochebed looked and saw a proper child. She saw a deliverer, as was promised by God in years to come. The topic this morning, or this evening, is the legacy of Amram and Jochebed, raising your children to be leaders of God's people. How do we train leaders for God's people? Amram and Jochebed was proactive. Wouldn't it have been easy to take that little baby and put him in the now? And you say, no, that wouldn't be easy. But wouldn't it have been easy to justify the soldiers are going to find them sooner or later? This is in God's hands. I'll take them out to the now, and I'll toss them in like all the other children, and I'll expect God to protect them. God will have his will. He's in control. How many thousands of parents must have made that same decision? But you see, Amram and Jochebed's faith was a proactive faith. They weren't focused on what they couldn't do. They couldn't overthrow the king, could they? They couldn't even keep their child forever, but they kept them for as long as they could. And then they did everything they could do. Putting him in that little homemade ark, putting him in the now, and watching at not that far of a distance to see how they could aid and how they could help and be the tools and servants of God. Parents, there's a lot of things we can't do. The technology that's before us is so great. Ernie talked about technology today, and we've talked about the challenges of technology, about updating and all that good stuff, and disconnecting from projectors already, Kevin. But there's greater challenges to technology. I don't know how many of you are aware of it, but pornography is eating our children. Ernie, if I was going to misbehave in that way when I grew up, I had to go through a lot of effort to do that. It's forever in front. of not just our children, quite frankly, but the average age that a child is exposed to pornography is daunting. Average age, last I looked, was 8 years old. You know the most common way they're exposed to it? Their parents. How many children don't? I'm reaching for my phone, but the guys in the back have it. How many children don't have a phone in front of them? Anna's raising her hand. There are challenges that we can't overcome. We can't change society. We can't change the temptations that are before our children. And they are far beyond or much more than just pornography. But what can we do? And I'll pause when I talk about parents because I meant to make this statement in our introduction, and I've said it in different ways as we go throughout this, but these lessons are not for just parents of small children. We have a task as a community of God's people to strengthen the faith of these young ones and to help them become the leaders that they need to be. So what do? We have to be proactive. Each and every one of us. That means that we don't sit back. We don't lay the children in the now wherever and just wait to see what happens. It means that, like Amram and Jochebed, we take action. If we need leaders in our churches, how are we going to get them? I wanted to read, if you turn to 1 Timothy 3, I wanted to call Ross Timothy. But Ross, not Timothy, read from 1 Timothy, the 3rd chapter. If we are going to raise elders and strong wives of elders, how are we going to do it? First verse of chapter 3, talking about qualifications of elders, says, the saying is trustworthy. If anyone aspires to the office of overseer, he desires a noble task. I've sat through a lot of sermons on elders. In fact, I sat through most of one right here. Amanda was still in college. We were sitting over there, and we had to leave before it was over. I won't mention individual's name, but most of you will probably know in a second here. But at about 10 after 7, Amanda and I left because I had to have her at the bus station, Du Bois, to go back to Penn State. And I think he preached on elders that night until somewhere around 7:30 or so. How do we get elders? Notice the first qualification of an elder. Sometimes we start down verse 2, don't we? In fact, we almost always start down verse 2. But the first qualification of an elder is in verse 1 of chapter 3. The saying is trustworthy. If anyone aspires to the office, he desires a good work. There's something noteworthy there about desiring the work, not the office. But he desires the work. How do we get our children to desire the work? It's how we talk about elders. It's how we talk about preachers. It's how we encourage them to be when they grow up. Would I encourage my son to be a preacher? I haven't. I sure encourage him to be a leader. If he preaches, that's good. There's challenges that come along with that as well. And we are lacking both preachers and elders in the church, strong leaders. We develop desire, and starts in early age. We turn TV on, right? Sundays, and football season was officially over a couple weeks ago, right, Ernie? All those teams playing now are meaningless. The Steelers were done a couple weeks ago. But we watch those athletes make amazing plays, and we say, wow, isn't that amazing? Right? We encourage our children. We go out in the yard with them, fathers, and we teach them how to throw a ball, right? Gabe had to perfect Evie's spiral. Dad hadn't quite got the teaching down pat yet, but Gabe helped me out. The same needs to be true when it comes to godly leaders. We need to encourage our children to be leaders in the church. If we don't help them develop a desire, they never will. The world certainly will not help them. Being proactive is we need to be proactive. Leads to Amram and Jochebed's faith acting on their faith. Amram and Jochebed acted on their faith. I mentioned this earlier, but when Moses was born, he was hidden for 3 months by his parents. They could have made lots of excuses. They could have said, well, God will take care of them. God promised to deliver. God will send a deliverer. But they didn't. They hid him for 3 months. They acted on their faith over and over and over again. James 2:20 says, faith without works is dead. You see, Amram and Jochebed did not display a dead faith. They acted on their belief. We trust that God will take care of them. Very well could have been one of the statements that were made. But they took the approach that Solomon wrote in Proverbs 22:6 to train up a child in the way that he should go. Now, we've talked the last couple of weeks about teaching our children. And again, every one of us here has a part in training our children. Right? You folks, many of you were such a huge part of my training, starting in my youth classes, coming up through the classes to the point that Mom made me get up here on Wednesday night talent night and give my first speech or give my first lesson. You played a part in that by encouraging me. They played a part in forcing me to keep doing it. You continued to play a part by encouraging me. And you know what happened when I got to school and that we had to take a communication class? I had 50 times more experience than anyone else. And so that by that time, I was just a little bit better than most of the students. And then by the time I got to college, I'd preached in a lot of places. I didn't understand why so many congregations would call me. Would you come preach for us? We need someone to fill in. I'd tell them no. I said to myself and I said to others, man, brethren are in the church are forward. They'd keep pushing. How are they getting my number? Later found out Uncle Dan was feeding them my number. I went to Butler. I went to Bradford. I went elsewhere preaching because Ligonier went to preach. He would say, now my nephew needs to be preaching. Now when you ask him, he'll tell you no. He's not real good at saying no, so you keep pushing. And that's what Dan was telling me. He played a part. My point is, it's not just parents. It's not just preachers. It's everyone working together. But what does it mean to train a child? We talked about teaching children. But we've got to go beyond that. Right? If we teach a child about basketball, it's not football season anymore, it's basketball season. Gabe, is that going to make someone a good point guard if you just sit down at a desk with them and tell them what they need to do? No. The word train literally means to exercise. You see, we need to exercise our children. Bible Bowl starts next week. It's one of the many, many ways that we strive to exercise our children. As a congregation, we need to train our children. As parents, we need to train our children. We're forming habits. What do we do? At times, the church has worship services or Bible studies. We are training our children. What do we do when there's conflicts between the two? We are not just teaching our children, we are training them by forming habits. As we look back in 1 Timothy, the 3rd chapter, verse 2, we read, "Therefore an overseer must be above reproach." Or the King James says, I like this a little bit more, I'm going to say that a little facetiously, must be blameless, right? We're talking about building desire. We're talking about training. You know how to discourage a child better and more effectively than anything else? Give them a goal they can never obtain. And they will stop. Fathers, I believe this is why Ephesians, the 6th chapter, says to you fathers and particularly, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. Fathers, I think in particular, we have a keen eye for criticism. And we can discourage and provoke our children with merely giving them what's wrong. Sometimes with the very best of intentions. And that's one of the things I think precisely it's happened with elders. That we say, well, they have to be blameless. They have to be perfect. And yet we know from Hebrews 4 and 15, there's only one man that was ever perfect. There's only one we read of being perfect. In fact, 1 John wrote in chapter 1, verse 8, any man that says he's without sin is a liar. So you could say, then saying we don't sin, we sin. So who could be an elder? Above reproach, many translations say. Let's get closer to the idea. What it means is something to grab a hold of. How many of you wondered what in the world the bathroom bar meant with that slide? Right? That's what this word above reproach or blameless means. That an elder would not have something to grab a hold of, a sin that could be grasped and used as a weapon against them. It doesn't mean that elders don't sin. It means that they're not chronically giving to the same sin. We need to teach our children that so that they have an obtainable goal. And then we need to train them to become above reproach. Not in appearance, but in action. And how in the world would we do that? Seems like a daunting task, doesn't it? This passage is an amazing passage from Isaiah, the 28th chapter, and verses 9 and 10. There Isaiah asks the question, to whom will he teach knowledge? And to whom will he explain the message? Those who are weaned from the milk, those taken from the breast. I was at a potluck one time, and Christian was kind of small, and he charged right at the front. We said amen, on the prayer, and man, Christian was right there. I latched a hold of him. I said, you sit down. You let everyone else go through first, especially these elderly people over here. It was a different congregation. We had elderly there. And the lady rebuked me. Said, he's too young to do that. Let him go. I said, no. He can wait. No, he's too young to wait. I said, if not now, when? And the question still stands. If not now, when? I think Isaiah answers the question. Those who are weaned from the milk, those taken from the breast. For it is precept upon precept, precept upon precept, line upon line, line upon line, a little here, a little there. In other words, I think we might say a little piece at a time. Anna, do these papers look familiar? We still do this type of thing, Amanda? Yeah. Here's my kindergarten teacher. How do we teach kids to write? We give them the perfect example for them to trace, right? And then we give them guidelines with the lines. I think as godly parents, we ought to be doing the same, working on our own example and helping them along the line. We're not going to go into details with these, but there's a book called Headed to the Office by Glenn Colley. He suggests these 8 pieces of advice. It's about developing elders. Love your sons or your children. Make some major family decisions and stick to them. Have nightly Bible time. Take truthfulness seriously. Give young children responsibilities. Guard your own example. Speak often of telling the truth and doing the right thing. And treasure times when it costs you to do the right things. Well, if you're interested in that list or the information on the book, I'll be happy to share that with you. They were successful in their child rearing. And how blessed they were. We looked this morning at Proverbs, the 23rd chapter, and verse 24, where Solomon wrote, buy the truth and do not sell it, but wisdom, instruction, and understanding. But verse 24 of this chapter says, the father of the righteous will greatly rejoice. He who fathers a wise son will be glad in him. Pam, do you think you'd have been proud to have Moses as a nephew? I think I would, as a nephew or a son. What a great legacy. They taught them. And when it came time, as we read earlier in 24 and 26, Moses made that decision. As a congregation, we need to continue to work on our children, both here and abroad. If your children are still alive, it's not too late. I'll share with you that something that concerns me. I'll say it in this format. Maybe it's more palatable, maybe it's less palatable in this format. So many times, and particularly before I came here, people would tell me I'm worried about my adult children. Then they'd tell me, hey, you won't see me next week. My children are coming over. And, you know, we could leave and come to worship service, but I don't want to upset them that way. Brethren, don't quit leading. Parents, don't quit leading. Aunts and uncles, don't quit leading. Keep leading. And keep giving hope. How did Moses get all of that faith? It started in the heart of Jochebed. Mothers, you are precious. Mothers, you are important. Mothers, stay close to your children in the formative years. I'm not laying any blame on mothers for children's decisions. What I am saying is, mothers, we have to stay close to our children. We have to care for them. The next qualifications for elders is vigilant and sober. Those require wisdom and example. Where are they going to get it? Gabe, do you know who this is up here? Is that your favorite basketball player? I didn't think so. Last I checked, it was KD, right? No. Was it at one point? Okay. I'm just a little bit behind it. Not completely off. How are our children going to be leaders? There's a reason I put Steph Curry up there. If he's your favorite basketball player, raise your hand. Evie's down here getting her hand just barely up there. Evie, if I was able to hire Stephen Curry as your personal coach, you think that'd be something pretty cool? You'd like that? Imagine if you had the opportunity to hire a professional athlete to train your children. This summer in May, Willie, Brett, and I were at the track. And kids flocked from all over that campus as they knew he was on there. Kids throwing footballs, kids throwing shot puts, kids running. Wanting a little bit of information, a little bit of guidance from someone who had achieved a very high level. It was interesting hearing him tell that the way he got into football was through a school program that took hopeless children and put them with their heroes. He didn't know what to say, so they sent him with the LA Rams. And he hung around those people, and it wasn't long till he was there himself. What's the point for our children? Put them around wise and faithful leaders of God's people. Immerse them with people who will guide and help them in the right direction. Give them yourself and provide every opportunity you have to be around people that have achieved what you want them to achieve. Legacy of Amram and Jochebed. I think this is amazing. There's not risen a prophet since in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. None like him for all the signs and the wonders that the Lord sent him to do in the land of Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all of his servants and to all of his land, and for all the mighty power and all the great deeds of terror that Moses did in the sight of Israel. Faith is transferable. Not just from parents, but from friends, from companions, from people we spend time with. Brethren, let's make sure that we are raising godly and strong leaders. I ask for your help. I probably spoke very forwardly about this topic, and I think it's important to say that's not because I know the answers, but because I'm passionate and I'm afraid about it. I've heard so many people growing up saying, my children will never. And I've lived just long enough to see their children, Paul, do exactly what they said they would never do. Christian turns 15 in just 2 months' time. I'm scared to death about the next 4 years. Not to mention the 2 little girls following him. What am I saying? I need your help. These other parents need your help. And let's strive to make the next generation stronger than the last. And let's strive and pray that the following generation would be stronger than that. And let's work towards a revival in the Lord's church. What are we? We are more than slaves, aren't we? Imagine what a slave couple accomplished with the help of God and their faithful son. This evening, if you'd like the prayers of this congregation, you have a spiritual need that you'd like to make known, then please come forward. Together we stand and sing.